Third signpost, from partisan to bipartisan responses. And I believe this very strongly. Last Friday in Boston, the Prime Minister invoked the leadership shown in the late 1940s, when he said new global arrangements had been agreed that saved the free world. It was a Truman-Eisenhower moment, a bipartisan accord of Democrats and Republicans to contain communism. But it was also a Churchill-Bevan moment, a bipartisan accord of Conservative and Labour. And I think we need that kind of bipartisan approach today, but we don't always have it. Why not? Well, I'd say firstly, in the 1940s, a couple of things were present that made a bipartisan foreign policy possible. First, a refusal to make foreign policy into a domestic political football. Now, can Harry Reid claim to have always refused that temptation in America? Can Dick Cheney? Can the German Social Democrats? I ask these as questions, but we've got to think about how we conduct ourselves on a domestic political terrain if we want to build a bipartisan consensus. Calling John McCain a warmonger, for instance, endlessly for the next 4 or 5 months is not going to help that at all. Second, in the 1940s, bitter fights were waged and won to defeat alternative strategies. On the right, the dream of a preventive war and military rollback was confronted and defeated. On the left, in Democratic clubs and Labour Party wards and union halls and seminar rooms and little magazines, an appeasing and accommodating approach to the Soviet Union proposed in America by Henry Wallace and his supporters was also defeated. Now, according to several of the interviewees, we in the West once again have what we could call a Henry Wallace problem. So that's my fourth signpost, which is towards a hard-headed internationalism. If you like, from Wallace to Truman, or if you like, in a British context, from George Lansbury to Ernie Bevan. The Islamist threat just won't come into focus still for many commentators. In the interviews, Paul Berman talks about what he calls a rationalist liberal naivete that stops us seeing the nature of the threat plain. For instance, which just refuses to believe that Hamas could possibly believe all that stuff in its charter about the Jews. They can't really believe any of that, can they? And this naivete and rationalism taught us, I think, on the edge of something worse, which is an anti-Westernism or an Occidentalism. A legitimate critique of the West, and that is a legitimate critique to be made, can morph into an incoherent opposition to America and Israel as the great and little Satan of the empire. And soon enough, anyone shooting at America, Israel, or the empire is by that act the resistance and to be supported. After all, as John Pilger says, we can't be choosing. Now, I don't say this has consensus in the room, but I suspect that attitude is more widespread than we want to admit, especially in what we might call, with apologies to Dwight Eisenhower, the media academic complex in the West. And from there, I think its spirit, appeasing and pacific, and its mental habits of denial and of moral relativism seep out into the popular and the political culture, poisoning the mainstream debate and sapping our capacity to defend our allies and oppose our enemies. Recently, the novelist Martin Amis asked a London audience to raise their hand if they felt morally superior to the Taliban. 1/3 did. Astonishing. So can we win the battle of ideas and the cultural Cold War the Prime Minister's called on us to wage when so many cultural workers are engaged in unilateral intellectual disarmament? Fifth signpost, from unilateral to multilateral responses. Unilateralism has driven some people mad. One interviewee, Jean Beth Gelstein, calls this phenomenon Bush derangement syndrome. And what came through to me from the interviews was the idea that multilateralism is the new realism. When I talked to Martin Shaw, a professor at Middlesex University, he argued to me that, he said, look, the idea that we ever were in a unipolar moment was a catastrophic error. For one thing, it fueled a certain hubris in foreign policy, which we're trying to recover from now, I think. But it misunderstood something fundamental about the world, he said. And he said this. He said, look, in the second half of the century, we had a transformation of the political context of world development. What I call globality, the sense of a common global consciousness in a single social space, reflected the political unification which began to take place in the world as a result of the overcoming of many of the rival empires. I think some mistook the end of the Cold War as a moment of unipolarity, and it wasn't. What was actually being unleashed were all the forces that have produced this perfect storm of globality we're trying to deal with. So I think Gordon Brown was absolutely right in Boston on Friday to stress we must move from a world economy to a global society built on a global covenant of shared values. And here I'll be bipartisan. I think the same idea is at the heart of a recent speech by John McCain, who appeals to us to strengthen our global alliances as the core of a new global compact, a league of democracies. I think it's there in David Miliband's notion of a civilian surge, new viral networks and civil society activism promoting democracy from below. So multilateralism, I think, is the only basis for the bipartisan policy we seek. Sixth signpost, from exclusive to inclusive globalization. I think globalization is a great thing. An absolutely great thing. More people have been lifted out of absolute poverty in China, for instance, in recent years than at any other time in human history. Just tremendous gains over the world. So the idea that capitalism has created a world in which working people have nothing to lose but their chains is dead. But let's just make it 2 cheers, not 3, because capitalism is still experienced as inhuman by many. And this came through particularly in David Held's interview. David Held's the author of a recent book called Global Covenant. Anthony Giddens has called ours a runaway world. And this is also, I think, the terrain of foreign policy today. Alongside the productivity and the innovation, the economic system can also eat up the resources of the planet, churn up communities, exclude the redundant, corrode social institutions, and overwhelm representative democracy. Many people fear that everything it touches, and it does seem to touch everything from childhood to health, is being turned into a commodity to be bought and sold. People feel insecure and harried, and in many parts of the world, basic human needs remain unmet on an appalling scale. Now, the jihadists offer no answers to any of that. They bring penury to any society they control, but they do feed on moods of alienation and frustration and discontent. So, by the way, do the new authoritarians such as Putin. So we Democrats must offer a better answer. Now, Michael Walzer, who wrote a preface for the book, he has an expression which is social justice is the new realism. And there might be an element of wishful thinking of us on the left here. Suddenly multilateralism is the new realism, and social justice is the new realism. But I do happen to think that they're right in the world we live in of globality as I've described it. And Tony Blair, I think, was also absolutely right when he pointed again and again to the intimate connection that exists between fighting against terrorism and for social justice. A progressive foreign policy, I think, is inseparable from the pursuit of what Amartya Sen calls, in a very happy phrase, development as freedom. And his idea is that what we have to do is humanize this runaway world by tethering the global economy to development and then tethering development to freedom and social justice. And if we can manage that, it will help us marginalize the lure of what Albert Camus called a primitive baying at the moon. So, they're the signposts that I took from these conversations, but they're very rich, and you might find a different set of signposts in there. From simplicity to complexity, old wars to new, from a partisan to a bipartisan approach, towards a hard-headed internationalism, from unilateralism to multilateralism, and from an exclusive to an inclusive globalization, with a banner that reads social justice is the new realism. So I enjoyed the book immensely, putting it all together, and that's what I took out of it. So thanks very much.